welcome Dr. Gessert.
Despite appearances, I would like to assure you there's no essential connection between orthopedic problems and an interest in end-of-life issues. Any quick reactions to the film? Any thoughts or burning ideas? I basically liked what he had to say, but I thought there were two major limitations, or two areas that I want to go beyond, that I want to build upon. The first of those was that in his choice of words and in his pictures that he created, there was an underlying assumption that death is a bad thing, and I want to spend some time on that. The second is that he was more oriented to healthcare than I'm going to be. In other words, when we think about death, in our culture, death is a medical event. In other words, somebody's dying, you call the doctor or the ambulance. But that's cultural. Death could easily be a family event, a spiritual event, an existential event, a legal event, an economic event. It doesn't have to be primarily or exclusively a medical event. To the degree that we medicalize death, we limit it, and we make it something that it doesn't necessarily have to be. I'm going to see if I can make this work now. As a matter of fact, I think that healthcare has an essential conflict of interest. It's illustrated here. His final wish was that all his medical bills be paid promptly. And so, you know, there's a limit to what medicine can really do with death, because there is an inherent there are different spheres. Tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about embracing mortality, the title of my talk. Now, you may be surprised to see up there, or winter, but I realized, Barbara and I were talking about this earlier, and we realized that we're talking to a group of people from Minnesota, and so an easy way to get a grip on this is you all know people, or you've heard people talk about when it snows in Cincinnati or St. Louis or Washington, D.C., it brings the city to a halt. It's a disaster. Schools are closed. People are skidding off the road. And here in Minnesota, we all look a little smug, and we all feel pretty good about ourselves. And we say, well, you know, there's no real bad weather. There's just bad clothing and bad vehicles and bad housing. But if you've got everything lined up properly, you're going to be fine. Well, I want you to transport that thinking, that line of thinking, from snow or winter to the approach of death. To the degree that you're in denial, as they are in Cincinnati, about snow, they think it's bad luck, that something, they're being punished, that the forces of the universe are somehow conspiring to make them have a bad day. Up here in Minnesota, we know better. And so the same thing, I want you to try to expand your thinking and apply that to being mortal. It's not a surprise. Winter is not a surprise, and being mortal is not a surprise. And in that same context, we can do three things. We can adjust our attitude. We can prepare, much as we do for winter. We have snow shovels, and we have equipment, and we have a lot of other things. And we can look for opportunities. Now, let's start with attitude. Back in Cincinnati, as I was referring to, they have a why me attitude. You know, why is this snow happening to me? Or why am I dying? We're going to move beyond that, because the why me, it's everyone dies. As a matter of fact, some people, here it says, Donald is such a fatalist, he's convinced he's going to grow old and die. Well, actually, the world death rate is holding steady at 100%. This should not be a big surprise. As a matter of fact, you can find yourself somewhere in the spectrum of life and death. It says, you are here. Next time you see a you are here sign, look for that. And I looking at our audience, now that the musicians still here, have they left? Okay, well, since they've left, then I can say that we've made good time. We're already in the valley of the shadow of death. I mean, most of us are well along in our journey. And I actually know how you guys read the obituaries. It looks like this. It says, 2 years younger than you, 12 years older than you are, exactly your age. Essentially, all of us read the obituaries that way, so there's some sort of recognition. And what we want to do over the next 10, 15 minutes, and by the way, I'm told I only have 20 total, right, is arrange things so that you can be comfortable with this, your name here. Now, I just have to tip my hat to religion. Religion has a big influence on how we think about death, mortality, afterlife, and all that. And the only reference I'm going to make to religion is the following, where it just says, bring marshmallows. I'm not convinced that that's the most constructive way. Okay, so when you talk about embracing mortality, how can you actually embrace mortality? What's good about mortality? Well, I'd like to say some nice things about mortality. I actually believe that mortality enhances life. Yeah, stop and think about that for a minute. Mortality enhances life. I think that mortality provides life with structure. It provides it with what you might call narrative integrity, a beginning and an end, a plot line, if you will. Events succeed each other and eventually build to, in our film where he referred to a crescendo, but essentially some sort of storyline that makes sense. You know, as people get older, they tell and retell stories about their life over and over again. There's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the underlying psychological reasons is to make sense, to create narrative integrity. And our mortality assures that we don't have a choice. We have to find a way of making narrative integrity out of our lives. But the last one there I'd like to really dwell on is poignancy. If you think about the things you treasure, make a list of them in your mind, or the things that you're amused by, or that you go, oh gee, when you see them, a puppy or a child or a sunset or a flower, every one of them is fragile. Every one of them is vulnerable. Every one of them is essentially mortal. And as a matter of fact, if you see a beautiful flower and then you learn that it's silk, it loses a little bit of its poignancy. It loses a little bit of its importance. So poignancy is a big part of what mortality provides to us in our lives. The richness of our lives is essentially dependent upon the fact that life is ephemeral. Life is fragile. Now, I'd like to look for a minute about just some facts about, we hear and we read about breakthroughs, medical breakthroughs. This disease is conquered, that disease is conquered, this aging is being looked at. Actually, what we're doing medically and what we've done over the last 100 years is we have adjusted our experience to more and more completely take full advantage of the potential of the human genome. And we are approaching the potential. 85 plus or minus 10 is roughly the potential of the human genome. Now, there are some populations, Japanese American women are an example, who are already there, who actually, as a population, live to approximately 85 plus or minus 10. Now, every now and then you'll hear about somebody that lives to be 115 or 120, and I have to tell you, they're not shifting the curve. All they are is 2 or 3 standard deviations away from the mean. And you stop and think about this, well, the way these curves work, that means that 2.5% of people are supposed to live to be 105. So we're nowhere near that yet. We don't have people living that far out. So it's a very useful thing to think that what we are doing as we improve longevity is we are taking larger and larger advantage of the potential of the human genome, but we're not changing the human genome. So really, death, the world death rate holds steady at 100% is actually very helpful. Now, I'm a pediatrician, or was until I retired, and I spent the last 15 years of my career or so studying end-of-life issues and end-of-life decision-making, particularly in families that had dementia, that have struggling with dementia. So I got a lot of jokes and questions about second childhood and stuff like that, which I basically objected to all the time. So I created this little graphic here to help us think about the normal course of a life. If you are healthy and live a long life, you will have experienced dependency at the beginning of life. Then you will have learned how to walk, cross the street on your own, do your own homework, drive a car, eventually get a job, marry, have children. You'll eventually have others dependent upon you. That's the middle part of the graphic. And if you are lucky enough to live long enough, a phrase I will use several times, you will eventually have a diminution of your independence. You will not want to do your own taxes, or you won't want to drive at night. You will want to have somebody else shop for you. You won't want to get up on a ladder. You won't want to clean the gutters. There are things that are just become dangerous for you after a while because you're not as spry, as agile, and as vigorous as you used to be. That, by the way, is good news. That means you've lived long enough, you've been lucky enough to have a full life. Now, why is death regarded as tragic? Throughout history, death has always been premature, sudden and premature. Death has been something that steals something from us. Now, in this little graphic, we see two things. If I die at the age of, well, I'm 71, so if I die today, I lose an intellectual life, I lose a financial life, a family life, a religious life. I lose a whole bunch of different things in my life. That's the line A, up and down. All the things I lose at that moment. But I also lose that future trip to Portugal and the books I'm going to read and the friendships I'm going to make. That's the area that's slanted and called B. So there's a lot of loss associated with death. Has been throughout history. Now, what about if a child dies? Well, they have small roles at the moment that they die. They're pretty cute, and we love them, and they bring joy to the family and all that, but they're not doing a lot of things in terms of generating income or intellectual discussions. But they have all that life that goes unlived. There's a huge loss, and that loss stays with people forever. It becomes part of the family, that they lost that child. So there's tragedy associated with the death of a child. However, in our society, increasingly we're experiencing death that looks more like this. There's been a full life. There's been a certain amount of deterioration, increased, if you will, dependency, a constriction of the vigor that we have in life, and the amount of tragedy associated with death after a long, full life. One way of looking at it is all the stuff that's in the dark blue is in the bank. It's safe. It can't be changed. It's secure. And the only things at play are the small future and the small number of roles that remain. Now, if you go to a nursing home visit and you look not necessarily at the person you're visiting, but at the people in the hall, sitting in the wheelchairs, many people are waiting for death, the next big event. Basically, their life story, their narrative, if you will, is pretty much complete. And they're waiting for the final paragraph of the final chapter. And of course, now, increasingly we see and we fear a death which is at the very, very end, after we've lost even the ability to communicate or take care of ourselves. And we have, if you would examine that, very, very small amount of A or B, which I would say are two ways of quantifying tragedy. So why is death associated with tragedy? Tradition and language. It's not necessarily because the reality of the experience today is tragic. Many, many people now die after a full life, and the family says, a full life. We miss them, we remember them, we honor them, but their death itself was not tragic. So, let's talk a little bit about preparation. Now, I want to do a review. We haven't been doing this very long, but I want to do a review. First of all, a full life is going to have to involve a forced choice between premature death and dependency. You either die prematurely, in other words, while you're full of vigor, and people will say, oh my goodness, what a shame it was that he died or she died. They had all this stuff to live for. Or after a period of developing dependency. It's a forced choice. I'm sorry, there's an A and a B. You don't get to choose anything else. You have to choose one of those. People do what they call rectangularization in their minds, meaning they want to be vigorous until they get shot by a jealous lover at age 94, or they get hit by a bus while they're hitchhiking to Canada, But that's the lucky few, and it's really unusual, not in the ordinary course of things. Now, I've heard a good bit of good news. It says, I heard a bit of good news today. We shall pass this way but once. And so we actually have, we have to make some choices. We have to prepare. And here's this one says, somehow it never occurred to me that if I lived to be 96, I'd be 96 for all eternity. Now, the fact that you guys showed up for a talk about, embracing mortality, maybe you showed up for the musicians, which were wonderful, by the way. Let's hear a round of applause. Anyway, but if you showed up for a talk on embracing mortality, you may already have the attitude that death can be too late. It says you're late. Gan Wilson is a wonderful cartoonist, by the way. And you may also have the attitude that it isn't really so bad, that death is not the worst thing that can happen to you. In our film, we hear him say, and I've heard this 1,000 times from people, that being dead doesn't frighten virtually anyone. Dying or getting dead is much more problematic, but being dead isn't so bad. So we have to plan ahead. Now, realistically, you can't plan ahead like this. It says, you're confirmed for Sunday at 5:30 a.m. in your bed, sound asleep. That kind of planning ahead actually isn't going to happen. If you don't plan ahead at all, you might end up like this. It says, I never thought I'd have to move in with my parents. And if you leave it to your family, it might end up like this. Getting warm. Warmer. But anyway, I studied this one a little bit, and the closet door is open, the little drawer, the table is open. I mean, death has been looking around, getting some help. And when I think about planning ahead, I'm not really talking about your last will and testament, that is to say what you're doing with your stuff. And I'm not really talking about advanced care planning, planning your medical care, because your medical care is, in a sense, an incidental part of your dying. Your growing old and dying is a natural part of life, and how you handle that medical care at the very end is a matter of individual taste. So planning ahead, you should prepare for the constriction of your life as it gets smaller, as your world gets smaller, as you would plan for retirement. Now that means there's positives and negatives. You're planning for retirement because it has a lot of opportunities, but it also has some dangers, financial or in terms of health. Same thing with preparing for confronting your own mortality. Now, the concept of preparing for restriction or constriction, it's very, that's the central concept. I might just say a brief word about my wife's father, who, as he got into his 90s, stopped driving. He stopped traveling essentially at all, even when others would drive for him. His world got smaller and smaller. However, he spent a lot of his time sitting in the back porch watching the clouds, and he would be absolutely mesmerized by them. His world got smaller, but in many ways rich. It wasn't a loss. The constriction was not only a loss. I think that the biggest thing in planning for or preparing for constriction is around attitude. If you are lucky enough to live long enough, you will experience a degree of dependency at the end of your life. And if you can just divorce that from the concept that that's a tragedy or a loss, and just say, hey, that's what I've earned. I've been lucky enough, I've worked long enough, I've built enough life in my experience that I now am going to experience a period where people can take care of me, or I can depend upon others to help me with some things. Now, if you're having trouble following this, we'll go back to winter for just a minute. When you're planning ahead for winter, you prepare your clothing, your housing, your transportation, and you prepare your attitude. And the same thing is true of preparing for being mortal. Now, if you're going to embrace mortality, you also want to look at opportunity. Now, here's where I can't talk for you. I only can talk about myself. And so basically it's a personal issue. What is an opportunity for me might not be an opportunity for you. But for me, it's using time well. Now, I'd like you to study this one for a while. It says, wasted and useful lives. As I study this, I have new respect for my cat. I think my cat has had a useful life. The opportunity to use time well, for me, means I get to examine my values. I get to examine what my legacy will be. And I get to examine a little bit about my bucket list. Now, a bucket list doesn't have to be magnificent. It doesn't necessarily have to be climbing the Himalayas. And my favorite illustration of that is here. Damn, I forgot to get her kugel recipe. The little things that we want to do we should put these on our bucket list. The person that you've never told how much you admire them, the person that you want to say you're sorry to. These should be on your bucket list. Your bucket list doesn't have to be a lot of huge things. Your bucket list should be all the little things that you want to take care of. This is important stuff. Use time well, and this list is simply to be continued. For myself, I wonder how much creativity I can build into the last quarter of my life. What do I value? Who am I? Some of you are familiar with the concept of an ethical will. That is where you try to write down what you've learned and pass it on to your children or to your friends. An ethical will is a very interesting concept. I suggest looking into it. My wife and I have been talking a good deal about green burial. This is not for everybody, but it turns out that in Minnesota, you can be buried on private land if you can coax your county into certifying your land as a private cemetery. So we're looking into it. I kind of like the idea that when I finally leave this vale of tears, I'll be nourishing some trees and some flowers pretty quickly. No embalming for me, thank you very much. If everything works out well for me and for you, you'll end up with this. There's no caption to read, I'm sorry. When death comes to the door, it's not taking something from me. And actually the quote from Shakespeare is, "The robbed that smiles steals something from the thief." Looking back, oops, it says here, so now what do you think of it? And so this is a time for discussion. And while you're thinking of your comments, I have one poem to read to you. "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." From T.